Simply Financial with Christopher Calandra, Certified Financial Planner, is an innovative, comprehensive, informative, and cutting-edge podcast that discusses financial topics ranging from personal finance, economics, politics, and personal growth. Simply Financial will cover intriguing and thought-provoking questions so that the listener can simply increase their financial IQ.
Welcome to the final episode of season number 3. This is episode 53. I do this show weekly. Somehow how the calendar fell, I ended up doing 53 episodes this year, so I worked incredibly hard. Maybe next year there'll only be 51 and I'll even things out. This is the Simply Financial Podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Calandra. And I have a returning guest today, my friend John Hyre. He is a tax reduction attorney and accountant. He's an author, a real estate investor, who speaks regularly on investing in real estate, and we are going to talk about some of the best books that we read in 2019. So, John, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So, how many books, John, do you think you read in 2019?
Probably, if you don't include work and periodicals and all that, probably about 70, which is sort of disappointing. In college, I used to read so much more, but now you know how it is. We have to make a living, so you can't always have your nose between the pages.
Yes. So I have a question for you. In today's, let's say, modern age, I listen to several books during the year. So I have a combination of books that I read, usually from the library, a book I'll purchase where I physically have the book in hand, but I also listen to a lot of books. I have a subscription to audible.com I have for several years, and I listen to books. So here's my question. If you say, Chris, how many books did you read? Do I literally have to tell you how many I read, or do I also include books that I listen to?
I would say each separately. They're a little different, and I admire. I'm glad you can get something out of Audible. I can't. I just don't retain it.
Really?
Yeah, and the only time I would do it anyway is when I'm walking the dog or driving. And now in Puerto Rico, I don't drive much, which is good because they're homicidal about that here. And then walking the dog, I might listen to somebody. I just don't retain it.
For me, it depends, John, a little bit on the subject matter. I seem to really like history books, listening to history-oriented books, and we'll talk about some that I listened to this year, because if it's a history book, it's kind of a storytelling about a figure or a battle or a war or something like that. I like the listening part because it's almost like storytelling. Whereas if it's something about my craft on investments or something like that, I'll tend not to be able to listen to that, and I'll fall into your thinking.
Okay, that's a
I'm
good
not going to
point.
retain it.
I've only listened to fairly serious books. I love history like you do, so I'm going to have to try and listen to a history book and see if I do better with that.
All right, that sounds good. I wanted to ask you, of the books you listened to this year, or read this year, I should say, which ones come to mind? What are some of your some of the better ones you read this year?
So I read lots of history and biography, very little business, a fair amount of sci-fi and historical fiction to relax, and then once in a while, I don't know what you would call this category, kind of motivational but kind of human nature. So 2 books I read in that category, Grit by Angela Duckworth, and a friend of mine sent it to me and said, I think of you when I read this book, which was a great compliment after I read the book. I wasn't so sure until I read it. And it's about how much perseverance and consistency, a sense of purpose, and really a lost art in our soft and effete modern age of just toughing things through and sticking to it. And the woman does studies. She actually started trying to prove that things like that.
So
okay, so we're just picking back up?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so Grit by Angela Duckworth, and I was saying it's a lost art in the modern world of toughing through things. Everyone is such a delicate, sensitive little flower, and we all have a reason to be a loser. And I think Duckworth, my recollection is she's a psychologist and started off with the society did it. It's not your personal responsibility or fault. But she's one of these last remaining people who has intellectual integrity. And if the data contradicts what she wants to believe, she doesn't double-check the data. She double-checks what she wants to believe. And really, it brought her around to personal responsibility and a decision to go forward no matter what and to take the hit and tough it through. What we used to call character matters more than we certainly give it credit for nowadays. So it gets away from the thumb-sucking narrative of the left-wing losers who think everyone who is not a dead white male has an excuse to be a loser, and they enable that inferior attitude. This woman's like, you know what, tough it up, stick it through, go get it. And she really backs it up, and it's also engagingly well written given the subject matter. A related book was by a Navy SEAL, what is his name, Goggins. I think it's David Goggins, wrote a book, Can't Hurt Me. And man, I'll tell you what, every time I start feeling sorry for myself and boo-hoo and I have this sickness or this hurts or I have that issue, you know, I go read that book and see what this guy lived through and what he put himself through, and I immediately just man up and stop whining and sucking my thumb. I mean, even by SEAL standards, this guy's insane. I learned about him because I read the book by, I forget the guy's name. He is a sort of comedy-type writer. He wrote a book called Training with SEAL, and he wouldn't give the name of the SEAL until the last sentence of the book, and then he said his name is David Goggins, which made Goggins famous, and people started learning about him. And the toughness and grit, I mean, the guy ran a marathon and still came in, I mean, he finished it, and it was one of these 100-mile desert insanity types of things.
Okay.
And he did that on a broken leg. So what's my excuse?
Yeah. Well, you know, to tie this in, actually a couple of quick things is I started reading Grit. I know it's very popular, and it seems like it's right up my alley. For whatever reason, I started reading it, and perhaps it was just a mental space I was in at the time, but I really wasn't into it, and I put it down. But after your recommendation, I'm going to pick that back up. And that was the first thing. I think I even forgot about the second thing. No, I know the second point I was going to make. I know Navy SEAL books are kind of in vogue now. For a long time, Navy SEALs didn't write books and weren't in movies, but that seems to have evolved a little bit over the last couple of years. But part of the reason that I like history books, aside from being a history buff, is that you read these stories, especially, I'll say, World War II era stories, and my goodness, you think about what these men went through in World War II as an example, and you got nothing to complain about. I mean, nothing. And I come up with the same message that you just spoke about, thinking about these guys going off to war in Europe or the Pacific. So you're a history buff. Did you read any good history books this year?
Oh, my God, a ton of them. I can't even remember all of them. I just read one about, and I forget the name of it. It was a fairly recent one. I mean, you can still see it in the airport bookshelf, which is where I got it, about the retreat of the 1st Marine Division and the other elements, but it was primarily about the 1st Marine Division from Frozen Chosen in Korea, the folly of MacArthur that he got them surrounded by the Chinese and the denial he was in about the Chinese coming over. And the Marines were outnumbered 20-1, utterly surrounded. But due to their own toughness and training and the foresight of their commander, God, and I wish I remembered his name. I'm remiss for not remembering his name because I think it was his surname was Smith, Prince. I think something, Edward Prince Smith, something along those lines. What a general, even by Marine standards. My God, what a man.
And I think he has that famous quote where his Marines were surrounded, and he says something to the effect of, we're in a good position, we could attack in any direction and kill the enemy.
Yeah, they've they've surrounded us. They've got us right where they want us. God help them. And we're not retreating. We're just attacking in the other direction. I think the second one was Chesty Puller, who was also in there.
Oh, yes, you're right.
And just, again, the toughness of these guys and the odds they were against, it was Oliver Prince Smith, the Marine General. What a genius. Okay. And what amazing men he led. I think that book, it's an easy short read, right? As compared to, I read both Washington and Hamilton by Ron Chernoff, who I think is a great writer. I read his book, Dreadnought, about the British-German arms race before World War I when I was a teenager, and I reread that book about every 7 years. And so everything he puts out, I read. His research, his depth on Washington and Hamilton, they're long books. I mean, these are
Oh, my God. I was just about to say, I mean, you show courage just having read those two books. I mean, those are thick, deep dives into Washington and Hamilton. I have not tackled them. I would like to, but I'm a little intimidated, so I'm thoroughly impressed.
It's you can't put it down the way it's written. You know, it wasn't this year that I read it, but you know who else did a brilliant job? There's a science fiction writer who's a Civil War buff by the name of William Forstchen, and he and Newt Gingrich, and this is a few years ago, co-wrote 3 books on the American Revolution. And if they don't make you weep, and also, I mean, weep both for what those people did and also for what we've done with it, what they went through, the miracles, and the writing, because Gingrich is a very well-renowned historian. He knows his history. And yes. Forstchen's ability to write and put it into more of a shorter, more easily read narrative and storyline. But, for example, I read every time Washington's troops retreating from New York literally under the guns of the British ships, and a fog came up and concealed them. It's wow. What men these were, and what they did, and what they sacrificed. And then, of course, I get upset with what we're doing with it.
So, John, doubling back to the Korean War. Korean War always interests me. My father served in Korea. Not during the hot war, but during the Vietnam era when it was sort of a low-grade battle. But my dad served on the DMZ, and my uncle, who I was close to, was actually a Marine at Chosin. So I enjoyed reading about the Korean War. So one of my favorite books, again, it's not this year, so we're a little off topic. I read it last year, but it's Devotion by Adam Makos. You familiar with that book?
I'm not. Tell me about it.
So it is about fighter squadron, aircraft carrier-based fighter squadron during the Korean War, providing close air support for the troops on the ground, including during those dark days of the Chosin Reservoir and the retreat to the south. And the central, I don't want to give it away because I'm really hoping you read it, but the central story is about a couple of guys in the squadron who become the best of friends. And the central story, the climactic element of this story is just right out of Hollywood, where if you saw it in the movies, John, you would say, oh, my God, I can't believe these people make this stuff up in Hollywood. It's really gripping, very well written, where you feel so strongly about the characters in the book. And it's probably the best book I've read in the last 2 years. So,
wow, okay, that's saying something.
By Makos. And this year, some of my favorite books. So you mentioned you don't have a favorite business book from 2019?
Let me look at my list here. What did I read? When I read business books, I read for more the message and less the detail, unless I really like it. I did put down here, and speaking of the Marines, because this is one of their mottos, leaders eat last. Yes. And I was really impressed with that. The guy wrote another book called Why that I have to go read, but I read Leaders Eat Last, and it was, again, one of those, I was just at the airport, and I saw it, and I'm like, let's see what's in it. And I couldn't put it down. It was really engaging about, just remember, people have gotten so focused